Aloha and welcome to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center's An Afternoon with the Author, where we invite authors from across the state and nation to come on and talk to us a little bit more about the backstory behind the books that they have written. Good afternoon. My name is Deidre Teagarden. I'm the Executive Director here at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, where our mission is to inspire people to find the hero within themselves through the legacy of our Nisei veterans. And you can find out more about our center on the web at nvmc.org. We are so thrilled and honored to have all of you join us today for this talk with author Tom Coffman and his book, How Hawaii Changed America, the movement for racial equality between the years of 1939 to 1942. Now, before I introduce Tom, I just wanted to go through a quick couple housekeeping items, which most of you already know, but we love getting your questions, so feel free to write your questions in that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen as they come to you. We will get to as many as time allows. We also want to say a big mahalo to our corporate sponsors who make this and all of our programs a reality. So I think you saw their logos as you were getting on. A big mahalo to all of them. And of course, this talk is being recorded and will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel. So we invite you to go there and check out some of our other talks that you may have missed in the past. This talk should be up in about a week. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our author today, Mr. Tom Coffman. Tom Coffman's first window into Hawaii was as chief political reporter for the Honolulu Star Bulletin through the years 1968 to 1973. A major character in the book, How Hawaii Changed America, John A. Burns, was governor at that time, and Japanese-American war veterans prominently populated the state legislature and congressional delegation. Since 1973, Tom has been an independent writer and producer. He received the State of Hawaii Literary Award, 3 Hawaii Publishers Annual Awards for Best Nonfiction, and numerous documentary film awards. The connecting thread of all his work is the social and political development of Hawaii in the context of the Pacific Rim. He has often been intimately involved in community projects. He helped write the Office of Hawaiian Affairs Cultural Plan. He served on the storyline work group of the Historical Gallery of the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, as well as the director and producer of their theme film, Gambare. He likewise wrote and directed the Judiciary History Center's film on martial law. His books include The Nation Within, The History of America's Occupation of Hawaii, I Respectfully Dissent, a biography of Edward Nakamura, and Tadaima, I Am Home. And of his PBS films, they include Oh Hawaii, From First Settlement to Kingdom, First Battle, The Battle for Equality in Wartime Hawaii. So please help me give a very warm virtual welcome to Mr. Tom Coffman. Tom, it's lovely to have you with us today.
Oh, thanks for that introduction.
Wow, you've done a lot.
I thought that was a short story, but it becomes kind of a long story, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay,
No,
it's nice to be here, and hello to you, and hello to everyone who's with us, and thanks for having me. Okay.
Well, thank you for being here. And what I'd like to kind of start off with is talking a little bit more about you. You are not originally from Hawaii, but you've spent a good part of your life here. So could you tell us originally where you're from and what brought you to Hawaii?
Yeah, I grew up in a small town, Linden, Kansas, in northeast Kansas. And I was born during the war. My dad went off to the war and was stationed in Hawaii, among other places in the Pacific. And when he came home, he brought an aloha shirt and a coconut and a few other gems. And I they're emblematic of growing up with my dad's story of Hawaii. He was deeply moved by what he saw and experienced here, and so I grew up with that in mind. And I remember Dad and I talking a lot about should Hawaii be a state, because on the one hand it's wonderful place. On the other hand, it's an island and it's way out there, when I was quite small, and it kind of went from there. And when I got out of journalism school, I went to Kansas University Journalism School, and I sort of grew up in the genre of Kansas small town journalism, meaning Emporia, Kansas, and Topeka, Kansas, and Kansas City Star. And I went to the journalism school that's in that matrix, and then I applied for a job with the Advertiser. And actually, I came here with the Advertiser. Buck Buckwhack brought me here. He loaned me, I said, he called me up and he said, would you like to come? And I said, yes, but I'm dead broke. And he said, I will lend you $600 that will get you here. So that was my stake in Hawaii. And he took it out of my salary at $100 a month. And I realized that you had 6 months to prove yourself. And if you didn't prove yourself in 6 months, you were gone. So Buckwhack wasn't going to lose his $600. But thankfully, I caught on. And I loved it, and I've been here ever since.
Wow. What a great story. Well, we're glad you're here, and we're glad that you've done what you've done. And the book is just a wonderful history. I mean, the names in this book, the people that you were able to, many of the people you were able to meet and, talk to Governor Burns at the time, must be really special for you. And you can see that in the writing. But when did you decide that this was the kind of writing and that you wanted to do?
Really early on, and I don't really know why, except that I grew up in a house full of books. My dad, I referred to already, he would not let us have a television set. We were the last people in our little town to have a television set. So I was 14 years old, and I'd have to sneak over to my friend's house to watch, basketball. We read, and we read to each other, and we talked about books, and that was what we did.
So how long was it before you started doing the research on how Hawaii changed America? And I just want to make sure people see the book. We have a few copies here at the center. It's available on Amazon, but if you love history, if you want to have a better understanding of the Hawaii that we have today, we can't say enough about this book. But what was the motivation to write this specific book? What spurred it on?
Well, I got the story first from Governor Burns. And I was bowled over by the story. and it was in about 1971. Because that was a period when it may sound strange, but people didn't talk about the war much. If they talked about the war, they talked about had to wear gas masks during the war. We had blackout during the war, and it was a pain. But the conversation was very superficial, and it was like statehood was what everybody was obsessed with, and the forward movement of statehood politics. And at any rate, he sat me down. I asked him for a long interview, and he sat down with me, and we talked for probably that part of the conversation was several hours. And I realized that it was a lot to do with what made him who he was and what drove him. And so the story was always strongly in my mind. And then fast forward to about the early 90s, the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii was being formed. And another famous figure from that whole dynamic, Sakai Takahashi, got me involved in developing the Japanese Cultural Center's historical storyline, and then I produced the short film that was in the theater. And in the process, I interviewed an amazing array of people, meaning like, Danny Noy about his experience as a Japanese American, Patsy Mink as her experience of a Japanese American, Mr. Takahashi, it went on, but the most amazing of all interviews, Ted Tsukiyama, who was famous with the 442 vets, right, brought this extraordinary, energetic, talkative, wildly interesting man, Hung Wai Ching. And the interview with Hung Wai went on for hours. And I realized that this was the connection to Governor Burns's story. And, I think I knew that in advance, but
Right.
I didn't realize, the level of detail, and that Hung Wai was like the inner story of this question of how Hawaii got through World War II, the crisis of World War II, and came out as well as it did.
Right. So before we dive into the book, I think to understand the context, we also have to understand that relationship between Japan and Hawaii that dated back to the 1800s with King Kalakaua and the emperor. So, can you give us a really brief 101 on how that relationship initially unfolded and how that was really the foundation of of everything moving forward as it relates to the Japanese Americans in Hawaii?
Stop me in about 120 seconds. Okay.
Right, right.
But Kalakaua was working on preserving his kingdom, trying to preserve his kingdom, and also negotiating with the sugar planters, and turned to in his trip around the world, his journey around the world, the first head of state to do so. His first stop was Japan, and his agenda for survival came out very clearly. He's trying to, in essence, make an agreement with Japan to counteract the growing influence of the Americans, long story short. But in the process, he facilitated or got started the recruitment of Japanese workers to Japan's plantations. And in the post-Meiji world, this was now something that Japan's government was willing to do. And when I think in all of this, there are a couple of things rise to the top. One was that while the Japanese workers arrived as workers, there was also a class of merchants and government consul and doctors and lawyers and so on, who served them and negotiated with the rest of society. And second, they were, wanted in the sense of played a crucial role. And symbolically, the king went down to the dock in the first arrival and welcomed them. And there was a sense not of antagonism to Japan, which was just on the cusp of really appearing within the United States foreign policy posture, but a very positive relationship with Japan. Kalakaua sent students to Japan. He exchanged medals with Japanese. His successor, Queen Liliuokalani, continued that. So there was a framework. I could go on, but you get the idea. There was a sort of positive framework around which the tough aspects of the plantation evolved.
So moving back to 1939, we have that partnership established, that bridge that was built so many years ago. And this book specifically is about the Council for Interracial Unity and their ability to circumvent a mass incarceration of Japanese Americans here in Hawaii at the onset of the war, which was something the West Coast, wasn't able to do. And there are two main figures in your book. Hung Wai Ching and Shigeo Yoshida, and these men were so far ahead of their time. Of course, the whole council included more individuals, but can you give us a little bit of background on Shigeo Yoshida and Hung Wai Ching and how special they were?
Well, Hung Wai I alluded to a little bit just by my personal interviewing of him, and then I had an ongoing relationship with him for a good while. I interviewed him and talked with him repeatedly, and he would call me up once in a while and tell me that I had to write this book, you Holly boy, and he was extraordinary because of his background from Chinatown, the Chinese communities, Christian church evolution. Though he became he was a star of everything student at McKinley High School, class of 24, famous class of 24, and star of everything at University of Hawaii, meaning student actor, great athlete, almost Olympic level athlete, and he loved kids, and he was like a magnet for kids, and he became a YMCA youth worker, and it was at a time when the YMCA was tremendously important in Hawaii. The YMCA is still important in Hawaii, but it was important on a level that we cannot really imagine today. The level of participation in the Y was various people who were on the scene at the time said, who had an overview of the Y globally, that participation in the Y here was more extensive than in any place in the world. Okay? And Hung Wai was right in the middle of this because Hung Wai had the connection with the young people. And he had gone from being the Nu'uanu Y youth director to Atherton House next to the University of Hawaii campus director in the brief sort of evolutionary period before the war. And that was his context. Shigeo Yoshida and he had crossed paths in the University of Hawaii debate team. It was Shigeo Yoshida who was, first of all, the territorial debate champion in high school as a Hilo high school student, son of an immigrant family where the man and the woman came together, interestingly, and I believe they quickly or immediately got into the contract sugar growing business that particularly occurred in Hilo, but it was something where there was a level of autonomy. And so he grew up in sort of North Hilo, excelled in school, became well known as in debate, went to UH and really took UH by storm as a debater. And it was at a time when like the chairman of the Regents, Charles Hemenway, was the godfather of the debate team. So the debate team would all come to his house. And it was he who organized their travels around the Pacific, around the West Coast, et cetera. So it was extraordinary backgrounds. And they came together as the threat of the war rose through Mr. Hemenway, actually.
So the council, the Interracial Unity Council, consisted of Yoshida, Hemenway, Hung Wai Ching, John Burns, and then Shivers, correct, from the FBI. And yeah, go ahead.
No, that's more or less the case. Actually, Burns was not a member of that original group, but he came to the subject through Robert Shivers, the FBI agent, and came to play a tremendously important role. It's a detail. essentially, they were all part of this network that made the crucial difference. And it was remarkably, there were the extensions of the networks, as we can get into from Maui, I hope. But the extensions of the network were many and into the hundreds and thousands. But the actual inner circle was of a handful of people. And the people who most actively worked at it constantly were really Shigeo Yoshida and Hung Wai Ching.
So
And
let's talk.
Then Governor Burns worked on it much of the war as well.
So let's talk about Shigeo Yoshida and the mantra that he came up with that, permeates throughout the book and through everything they did was, I paraphrase, how we get along during the war is how we are going to get along, when the war is over. But talk about the importance of that and the brilliance of that.
Well, it was brilliant. I think it was brilliant because in a sentence, it encapsulated the whole dynamic of where they were in crisis and where they needed to go and what the ramifications of it would be. And as a literal statement on the surface, it was like obviously true. But as the person who developed the message, developed the strategy on behalf of the Japanese community, and then developed strategy for the whole community, actually. But it said, we are many, okay? We Japanese are many. Treat us fairly. We will do everything that we can. We will commit full out, but you commit to us. And bonded together, we will get through this crisis and this war. And we come out on the other side, and that will determine how well the future unfolds. So there was a loaded two levels of message.
Right. And we can talk a little bit later about, the McKinley rally and everything. But I know you were alluding to the different morale committees that there were. And while the book really focuses on Oahu, you were talking about the Maui Morale Committee. And, we'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Okay, but for sequence, maybe I should just allude to the McKinley rally really briefly, because the McKinley rally preceded the war, and it reflected the way that the Army, which had been stationed in Hawaii, had been brought along and had come to have a very positive view about the Nisei, the young Nisei, basically. And this was not just a view in the abstract, but Hawaii had had ROTC since 1923. So kids who went to McKinley High School went through ROTC, and everybody who went to the university went through ROTC. And in 1940, the United States government instituted the draft, and suddenly there were about 2,000 Nisei who went through basic combat training at Schofield Barracks. And so there was a lot of interaction and the suspicion was just crumbling, and the positive view of the Nisei soldier was rising based on their performance in all these settings, and also just based on acquaintance, you know. And so the army, Shigeo Yoshida wrote a speech for the head of army intelligence, and there was this rally of 2,000 students at the McKinley Auditorium. Is huge. For those of you who have been there, you know that. You can pack a couple thousand people in there, and there was a tremendous amount of public emphasis on this rally, and it was a patriotic rally in which, using Yoshida's speech, the army colonel stood up and said, basically, you be loyal and participate in this, and they didn't say the coming war, but by June and July of 1941, there was a strong sense in Hawaii that the war was only a matter of time. And we will do everything we can to include you and to treat you fairly. And it was like the striking of a public doctrine and a public bargain. It was completely beyond anything that was going on in the West Coast or going on in Washington D.C. It was like national policy, except it was a national policy for the territory of Hawaii. So that was extraordinary, and they had asked Hung Wai to write it, and he said, me write it. I'm not the writer. Hung Wai, Shigeo is the writer. And he always had a funny line. I am the mouth and Shigeo is the brains. Shigeo wrote the speech, and it was the first really big public expression of this whole strategy of how we're going to get from here to there.
When I think that the speech even started with the words, my fellow Americans, making sure that everybody in that audience knew that they were part of America. And that was so important to do. And
I did block off briefly, and I'll just do this really quickly. Yoshida, accompanying this, he developed these like 8 steps to how we get there, and I will read abbreviated versions. First of all, people need to sign on to the idea that, quote, Hawaii has something unique and worthwhile to preserve in the way of human relationships. Step 2, we must have a united citizenry because it is essential to our national defense. In other words, we couldn't be divided here in Hawaii, or it would be a national security disaster, right? Step 3, we must all have faith in the American way of life and be willing to protect it. 4, trust authority. 5, the people must overcome fear. And his reference to fear was very important. People have to overcome their fear of the government, and the government has to set aside its suspicions and fears of what may be going on in this really large Japanese community. So it's an element of trust. So the trust theme recurs. Everybody has to take personal responsibility for how this works. Be willing to give, and the people must have an opportunity for every loyal citizen, regardless of race, a place in the scheme of national defense, which was going to become fundamental, right? And then step 8, remember, and this was a nice expression of his recurring theme. Remember that loyalty grows only when it is given a chance to grow. It does not flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion, discrimination, and denial of opportunities to practice that loyalty. So in the briefest form, those are sort of the doctrines that underlay the work.
And the McKinley rally that you are talking about, that occurred in 1941. So it was June 13th, 1941, preceding, what was to come. So after that, they would send out the various morale committees, correct?
Yeah.
To share this doctrine. And you had told me the other day when we were talking that there was a group that came to Maui.
Yeah, no, and I think it was very important. First of all, in a tremendous crisis mode because of the bombing and the chaos, really. The first big round of work was on Oahu, and included the mobilization of Nisei guardsmen, and then it's very complicated. Okay, and then the first outing to another island was to the island of Kauai. And I think it was because Kauai, is very isolated. Morale on Kauai was supposedly really low. And also Kauai was the most in danger of being invaded because it was the closest to Japan. So one of the strategic fears was always that an outlying island, meaning outlying from Oahu, would be invaded and then used as a base of invasion for invading Oahu and Pearl Harbor and the whole military establishment here. So there was a strategic aspect to this, but the driving dynamic was really the idealism that Yoshida had articulated. And I ran off some of my writing about Maui, and if you bear with me, I'll read a little of it.
We would love that.
And you know what? And I'm going to read some names too, because I want to see if any of these names are still recognizable, and if people can jump in and give feedback, because I'm talking all the time here, and I know there's a big audience out there. Okay. The arc of morale work on Maui was much like Kauai. The Pearl Harbor attack had caused, and Maui reported, a sickening feeling in the hearts of every red-blooded American citizen of Japanese ancestry. The FBI arrests of the relatively few on Maui, the arrests had created fear. Older Japanese tended to withdraw, which is very important to the story, okay? Once more, the arrival of the Emergency Service Committee from Honolulu reversed this downward drift by licensing the involvement of the Japanese community in the war effort. Maui County's Army Commander, Colonel Charles B. Lyman, a product of Hawaii, had effectively managed the initial wave of fear. And that Colonel Charles Lyman was the brother of the more famous General Albert Lyman, who was the person at Schofield Barracks who welcomed the Varsity Victory volunteers and did a lot to include Japanese Americans in the military through Schofield Barracks. So what was important was the Lymans were Hawaiian. They were the first Hawaiians who held high rank in the US military. And they understood Hawaii. They understood where they were and what they were doing. They understood the importance of culture. And so I'll skip this part, but they very effectively reached out to the Filipino community, for example, to praise the Filipino community for their restraint, because the Filipino community was tremendously upset about the invasion of the Philippines, etc. And they had done a good job of weathering the crisis and keeping things calm. The HCNS Sugar Company, which I say occupying the north central plain of Maui, you don't need to be told that, had a population of nearly 8,000 people out of a total island population of 46,000. Its largest element was Japanese, who occupied many of the plantation's 30 camps. In January 1942, camp leaders were called in to the HCNS personnel office. The authority figures were Lawrence Chu Baldwin, who was the personnel manager of the plantation, Dr. Homer Izumi, a physician of Japanese ancestry who worked at the Kula Sanatorium, and a judge, Edna E. Jenkins. The first question was the recurring rumor that concentration camps were being built on Molokai to house the entire Japanese alien population. Through a translator, the Japanese camp leaders were told that the rumor was false, that the practice of it, and then they were also told the practice that was going on widespread of destroying the emperor's pictures and pictures of relatives who were in the Japanese military should cease. What mattered was not possession of a picture, but loyalty to America. The meeting reviewed the martial law prohibitions of firearms, ammunition, explosives, shortwave radios, swords, spears, bows and arrows, cameras, and binoculars. Offshore fishing was prohibited for all, and Japanese were also prohibited from fishing from the shoreline. A Japanese man who had worked for 35 years for the plantation spoke up. "My children and grandchildren have been born here. I will live here and I will die here. I am a good citizen. I want to thank you for coming here today and saying these things to us. We will work harder than before. All we want is to know what we should be doing." And let me digress briefly and read to you who was in the coordinating committee at that point. Let's see. Dr. Edwards Kushi, Masao Aizawa, Harry Inoue, Dean Shigeta, Toshi Kuwada, Masaru Omori, and George Hasegawa. And this was a growing group. So they soon would recruit Shoji Seki, James Tagawa, Shizuichi Mizuha, Sadao Hirata, Shuichi Yamamoto, George Ito, Eddie Sakamoto, James Shigeta, Minoru Tanaka, and Oliver Kamita. Okay. Okay, I go on. within a few days, Yoshida and 3 other men from the Honolulu Emergency Service Group arrived for a barnstorming tour that they had developed earlier for Kauai. In 2 days, they spoke to 770 people. They recruited the district chairman that I cited along the way. As they went, they recruited people. So it was like an organizing, barnstorming, and oratory. And the oratory was almost entirely in Japanese. So Yoshida was like bilingual. But this is the person I go back to, was the debate champion in Hawaii and on the West Coast and in Japan and so on. So he wasn't just any ordinary speaker. And one of the other speakers was Masaji Muramoto, who became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, among other things. So these were high-powered presentations, okay, out in the plantations, basically. Dr. Izumi reported that after a slow start, the committee quickly gained, meaning the Maui committee, gained momentum and is up to its neck in work. One of its first acts was to visit the detainees who were at Haiku on the northern coast of the island. Following the Kauai example, layers of contact workers, meaning people who would go from the committee and into the community and make contact, were recruited as outreach. And so each family had an outreach worker. And they were organized for things like going out and somewhat well-known still, I think, cutting keawe along the shorelines to create fields of fire and other volunteer activities. But that was something that became well-known enough that it was called the Keawe Corps. One Sunday, the Keawe Corps consisted of 700 people. So many, quote, they reported, they were getting in each other's way. By January 1943, the Maui Morale Committee reported that involvement in the war effort had made people feel wanted, lifting much of the fear and uncertainty. As a result, the Japanese people have regained much of the self-respect which they lost on that fateful 7th of December, 1941. This is their report. Although Dr. Izumi pursued ethnic organization, meaning organizing the Japanese, as a short-term imperative, he, along with other members of the Emergency Service Committee, sought to create an integrated community. And he wrote, "An interracial program for the future is obviously the only solution for all of us in the territory." So I'll sort of stop right there, but that's a glimpse of what was going on in the Maui aspect of this territory-wide organizing, mobilizing, calming, focusing, and it was what preceded the organization of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd. So to bring it down to the focus of the organization, it was the groundwork which preceded the participation of the Nisei veteran in the war.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it's in your new book called titled Inclusion, which is going to be out later this year, which is basically the book that we're talking about today, plus the next part of it. And definitely those names, we know those names, and sure they're very special to a lot of the people on this call. You know, talking about that, the interracial community and how this is how we have to function for the future. You know, these individuals were so forward thinking. And, you look at what we're dealing with today on the mainland, whether it's the horrible acts of Asian hate, Black Lives Matter. These men were talking about these ideals and pushing them forward back in 1939 to 1942. How can, the title of the book is How Hawaii Changed America. How can we continue to share these stories and truly make a change?
Well, I think that in Hawaii, we do that every day, in this sense that people look to Hawaii as a way in which a multiracial community in America can actually work well. And so I think that's important. And my thing is to share, my obsession is to share this particular story, which is how important it was in crisis, how important the earlier day interrelationships became the crucial relationships which kept things together as opposed to flying apart and being a complete disaster. And I think there's an analogy to today in the United States because we're under such internal stress. And in the lead up to this, I write a lot about the intentional gathering of people and sharing that went on that long preceded the war. And then the intentionality of the organizing that went on during the war. And one of the most interesting chapters of the next book is an account of the 4 territory-wide conferences that the Japanese American community held in the course of the war, raising the question of, when the war is over, what will we do? And there was this dialogue that went on between the battlefield and the people in the home front. There was a great deal of conversation that went on, among Nisei soldiers that I can document. And it is a kind of farsightedness that has a tremendous reward if we actually engage in it in good faith and stick to it, And so I think in that sense, Hawaii sets a good example.
Yeah.
I think I would add, I think the example of that time would be good for us to look at now in Hawaii as
Indeed.
well as elsewhere.
We are gently coming to the end, but we're going to go a little bit longer because we started a little bit late. We have some questions to answer, but I just wanted to bring it full circle, compared to the mass incarceration that happened on the West Coast. Hawaii did also have incarceration, and they were, whether it was detention centers here in Hawaii or being sent to the mainland, it did happen,
Yes.
which is regrettable and wrong. However, the numbers from Hawaii in the book, you were talking about like a little over 500, under 1,000 potentially, nothing compared to what the West Coast experienced. And giving direct, uh, uh, because of the Council for Interracial Unity,
Yeah.
they were able to keep those numbers down. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
There were, it was an interesting thing because the national government, and it's important to realize that this was all national government stuff. So it wasn't anybody who had anything to do with Hawaii. I think if purely people in Hawaii had controlled it, there wouldn't have been, if there had been arrests, it would have been, I don't think there would have been arrests. I think there would have been a kind of system of surveillance and paroles for a few people. But the national government was seized by fear of espionage and sabotage, and was surveilling Japanese all over the place, including Japanese in Hawaii. And what was happening is that the arrest list for the West Coast was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It was about 8,000 by December 7, 1942. And the Hawaii list was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the FBI got pulled into this. Actually, what happened was the director, the famously Robert Shivers, the FBI agent, first consulted Hemenway and said to Mr. Hemenway, tell me what's really going on here. And he said, and Hemenway vouched for all these young men that he knew at the university. And Shivers said, give me some people to work with. And two of the first names were Hung Wai Ching and Shigeo Yoshida. Okay, so that's part of this personal story. But through this process, the initial arrest on December 7th and December 8th was about 500. It's a little less than 500. And then there were some additional arrests, I think very poorly thought out for the most part, because they involved Kibe, who had studied in Japan. And so there was an automatic suspicion that I think was very misplaced. But the total, depending on your definition of arrest and detainment and incarceration, ran in the between 1,500 and 1,800 people. And so as a percentage of the 160-some thousand people of Japanese ancestry, it was a very, the effect was this is important. I'm not to be dismissive of it, okay, because that's not the point of the book at all. It damaged, and to the point of nearly destroyed, the Japanese leadership of the community in terms of, Shinto priests, Buddhist. Many of the Buddhist priests were also incarcerated. Japanese newspaper editors, Japanese newspaper writers, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on, but there was a type of first generation leadership that was basically undermined and put on ice. And that was the evil of the national government's policy of incarceration. But it was limited, and most people of Japanese ancestry went about their lives under wartime conditions. And then it allowed for the more familiar history that we have, of the mobilization of the Nisei American soldiers, and the turn of it to a much more heroic and triumphant narrative
But you're right. I mean, just evil is the perfect word. I'm going to go through some of these questions in no particular order. Marilyn is asking, was Marston's speech mentioned on page 238 included in the congressional record by Delegate Samuel Wilder King?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Hester is asking, how did this committee reconcile Executive Order 9066 and the racist treatment of the West Coast incarceration?
How did they reconcile it?
How did they reconcile it? And is that something maybe you go into in the next part of your book, the second part, inclusion?
Yeah. Well, it was a very uneven thing. They basically were appalled by it, and then there's a really interesting thing of people in Hawaii. First of all, it was Hung Wai Ching who, went and talked to the Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, and then talked to people all over the country about why Hawaii was setting a different example. But there were a lot of other people. There were other people, most famously Spartan Matsunaga, who went on national tour and talked to thousands and thousands of people to counteract the poisonous sentiment against Japanese, and basically to help shut down the camps and the internment. But that's like addressing a gigantic problem.
Right.
But Hawaii became part of addressing that problem, and was in essence used by the national government, which there's a horrendous thing about one of the horrifying things about the internment was you see very quickly through looking at the story through Hawaii, you see very quickly that the top level national government people, by and large, realized that the internment was a disastrous mistake almost immediately, and that they had misread the whole thing because it was largely propelled by hysteria that the Japanese in Hawaii had committed sabotage that facilitated the success of the bombing. And nothing could have been further from the truth. And pretty quickly, smart, the most, what would you call him? The most conflicted figure in the book was the person, John J. McCloy from the national government, who organized the internment and then came to Hawaii and realized that he had it all wrong, and facilitated organization of the 442nd and the 100th. It's completely insane, It's schizophrenic.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. Actually, two questions. I'm going to ask. The first one's from Mark Matsunaga. What do you think about the proposal to rename McKinley High School? And how do we reconcile demands more Native Hawaiian autonomy with World War II notions of American patriotism? But maybe just start off with, what do you think about the proposal to rename McKinley?
Mark Matsunaga, hello. I support that, and I do it with great reservation. I've been sitting here imagining writing something about how conflictual the whole thing is, because I understand both sides, okay? But I will say straightforwardly, I support the renaming. It comes down to, do we rename it or don't rename it? But what I do think we have to do is have a massive community conversation about this uh, colliding understandings of history. The two main streams of our history are the forced integration of the Hawaiian kingdom into America and the event of World War II, through which most people struggled for and became fully American. And these two reach a friction point at McKinley High School. So this whole debate is very loaded and needs to be approached with great care. And if anybody wants to, I will work on that with people far into the night.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes, Tom, for some closing remarks. I will say that Bill Wright wrote in and said, why should the children of today understand these stories of 80 years ago, and how do we talk to them to make these stories important to them? Maybe you can answer that when we come back, but for everybody else, we just wanted to thank you for being with us today. We wanted to give a huge mahalo to you, Tom, for coming on. It's been very educational and very good afternoon conversation. Upcoming next month, our afternoon with the author is going to be April 17th, and that will be with John Tateishi, who wrote the book Redress. We do have signed copies here at the center. And then on April 8th, our East Meets West event is going to be with the president of Osaka University of Sports and Sciences, Dr. Munehiko Harada, and the CEO of Hawaii Tourism Authority, Mr. John DeFries. They will be talking about everything from gender equity in sports, sports tourism, and the fate of the Tokyo Olympics and whether or not people are going to be able to get in and watch the Olympics. On April 27th, Lori and Ann Teranishi will be sharing their presentation, 4 Generations, 2 Sisters, 1 Dream, about their family history. And then next week, on March 25th, General Bramlett will be back with the second in his series, The Nisei Soldier in World War II. He will be speaking on the 100th Infantry Battalion. All of these talks are on our website. You can sign up for the talks on our website, or you can always just email us or give us a holler. You have all the information in the emails that we sent. So please let us know if we can help you sign up for anything. Tom, I come back to you for some closing remarks.
Oh, well, I just want to give a shout to Mark Matsunaga and Bill Wright. They're my, fellow travelers and soul brothers in this project. So they come up with the most difficult questions. They're tremendous, difficult questions embedded in our experience, and I hope just that this project can contribute to a discussion, but there has to be a larger project of discussing how we got here and where we go from here. And it sounds like you're doing a great job of bringing people together here, and so I'm very appreciative of that and appreciative of the opportunity to be on your program. And if I knew, at any rate, aloha to those of you who are here, and hello to my friends who are here. So thanks a lot. Dee Dee. I really enjoyed it. Okay.
Well, thank you. I feel like we definitely could have spent more than an hour on this book, and perhaps when you have inclusion published, we can bring you back if you are available. I know we'll have a lot of people that would like to see that.
I would be welcome then.
Excellent. So thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you for your important work. Thank you everybody out there. And as Tom said, let's continue that conversation. Until we meet again, ahui ho, take care, be well, and stay safe. Aloha.
Aloha.